Hello there, my friends. Chris Marcus here with you on Wednesday, July 19th. And today, just a quick video about why sometimes you hear people talk about silver in favor of gold. I'm sure there are people out there who like gold in favor of silver too. Um, but just a few of the reasons why I tend to lean towards silver as opposed to gold. I think they're both going to go substantially higher at some point, sooner than later, in my opinion. Again, this is not legal financial advice. I'm just sharing my view. Commented a lot on why I think that's happening, but in either case, I started out when I first started seeing different perspective than what we were told by Wall Street or business school or any of these things, and realizing, wow, there really is a lot of debt. This doesn't take long actually looking at the numbers to see, you have this much and the ability for the U.S. to ever repay, or perhaps for the Fed to unprint the money they've printed without collapsing the thing either. Once you get to the point where you see there's some sort of issue here, and if you then subscribe to the fact that this currency system will possibly play out, I would say probably play out like all of these paper money currency systems over time, that I've heard, I guess there's maybe that rule of thumb that they usually last about 40 years or so, which, given if you look when Nixon took us off the last peg to any sort of metallic standard back in 1971, it seems like shouldn't be that much longer. So again, when I first started going down this road, the first purchases I made were gold. And again, I think gold's going to do really well, because if you just think of these things, again, there's a lot of emphasis put on price targets, and which can be helpful, also sometimes not so helpful if you don't have a good framework for it. But keep in mind that the gold or a piece of silver, just think of it as a rock that sits there, that it's not changing. But let's say that right now, gold's somewhere around $1,200 an ounce. So let's say there was only 1 ounce of gold in the world, and there were only $1,200 in the world. It's just a fraction. So it'd be $1,200 an ounce. But in this very small, limited economy, let's say your local central banker comes along, prints another $1,200. So now there's $2,400, and there's still that 1 ounce of gold. So the fraction is increased. So again, nothing is changing with gold or silver. It's just that the amount of money printed. Now, obviously, there's a supply and demand factor as well, which is a big part of the reason that we'll get to in a second of why I like silver so much. Again, not that gold isn't good, but just silver to me, again, I'm not giving you any specific advice or telling you what to do, but I have yet to come across anything that my entire financial career or anything I've read or studied historically, I don't know that there's ever been a situation quite like silver where I believe they're both manipulated, or although in ways that perhaps might be for another day, I believe, and this is more of a feeling or intuition than perhaps seeing it firsthand, although much as the poker game that the markets have become, that's sometimes what we can work with. So again, factor that in as you will, but I get the feeling that silver is a lot more manipulated, especially the number of contracts, and I don't think anyone actually knows for certain how many different pieces of paper, so for every ounce of metal, you could say 100 people own it, or when you factor in the derivatives, people smarter than me that say it gets into the multiple hundreds. So there's that component that for every ounce of metal, I would guess there's more paper claims per ounce on silver than gold. That would be a pure guess. Although what we can know, and actually there was a great Rob Kirby interview this morning on posted on Silver Doctors. I didn't catch who the interviewer was, although Rob Kirby quickly becoming a folk hero in the Marcus household here. I'll link to it below, and if you have about 45 minutes, it'll be worth it, especially if you're driving home. But an excerpt for that one today, because I'd been thinking about this, and towards the end of it, Rob had a few interesting quotes where he says silver to gold, it comes out of the ground at about an 8-to-1 ratio. So another way of saying the same exact thing, for every ounce of gold that's mined, 8 ounces of silver gets mined. Yet right now, the price ratio is 70-to-1. So basically it's being sold at a 70-to-1 ratio, whereas the actual amount coming out the ground each year, somewhere around, he said 8, I've heard 10. I looked up some numbers earlier today where it looks like about 88 million ounces of gold are mined each year, whereas about 880 million ounces of silver get mined each year. So somewhere in that 8-to-1, 10-to-1, but just think about it like this. If you took $5,000 into a gold or silver shop, let's say you split it in half, put $2,500 into gold, $2,500 into silver, you'd be getting silver, because it's so much cheaper relatively, at a 70-to-1 ratio. So if, again, another way of putting this, if the silver price would have to rise substantially if it were to be priced at 8-to-1. So there's a lot of people who think that silver relative to gold, based on how much there is in the ground, is already a bit cheap. So if gold price didn't even move, but that ratio were maintained rather than 70-to-1, I think about it. If you did a 10-to-1 ratio, silver would be $120 without gold moving at all to achieve that ratio of matching what we're getting out of the ground. So, again, does that mean it will happen tomorrow? It could, but not necessarily. So, these aren't things that are new. I mean, a lot of this has been out there, but again, I'm not going to tell you to go out and buy gold and silver, but what I'd like to do is present some of the information that you can feel free to factor in and understand why people are doing such things, why I've done such things, and when people have asked me based on my experience what I would recommend, certainly silver is one of the things I think can be right for the right person in the right scenario, especially if you give yourself that long time window. But here are some of the other reasons. So if we continue on here, great quote as Rob was wrapping up his interview. He says, virtually every ounce of gold ever mined is in existence in stocks on the face of the earth. And silver, being a dual-use metal, being monetary and industrial, silver tends to get consumed. And the reality is there is much less in terms of stock of silver available above ground than there is gold by a factor of 8. Now, again, one of the things that's a little tricky is how much gold or silver is there actually above ground. You know, that depends on who's counting. I would say the consensus number for gold is about 160 to 190,000 tons. Although I actually have a book on the way called Gold Warriors, which claims there's about 2 million tons somewhere in the Grand Canyon. So again, there's a little bit of guesswork that goes in here, and factor that in as you will, but just presenting what Rob says there about there being more above ground gold than silver at this point because so much of it is consumed. Mentioned earlier, you have 880 million ounces of silver mined each year, but I think it's somewhere around 600 or 700 million of those ounces is put into all the various applications, which, again, I'm not your not a super techie, although every time I hear people who are talk about the growing use of how so many of our applications and technologies have silver. I don't know. I think it's going to continue to happen, that there's going to be a great demand for silver, whereas most of the gold is still there, but a lot of this silver disappears because it's used. Continue with Rob. There is widely admitted to be roughly around 1 billion ounces of silver in existence in above ground stocks, which is about the amount of silver that's mined out of the Earth's crust in a year. Whereas there is probably 7 to 8 billion ounces of gold in identifiable or alleged above ground stocks. If you do the math, that 7 to 8 billion ounces number he mentioned equates to somewhere in that ballpark of the 160 or 70 or 80,000 metric tons. Not if there is that super hidden gold stash in the Grand Canyon. So if there is, then that would just mean that gold relative to silver, there's even more. Lastly, to finish Rob's quote here, so silver is in reality is more rare above ground on the planet than gold. Why it's trading at 1/75th of an ounce of the price of gold is something that maybe Mr. Mnuchin and the folks at the Exchange Stabilization Fund would like to explain in detail, which that's why I'm in the Rob Kirby fan club. I mean, now again, I've linked this interview below. Really worth checking out. Some of the history he gets into, and what he's implying there is the manipulation that many feel on some level is being sanctioned or allowed or directed. Somehow involvement on the government level, which certainly has always seemed plausible to me, because again, it's like if you had seen anything like this in the stock market, I mean, it's not, we already have banks that have confessed to doing it, yet it still continues. So again, that's my opinion. You can listen to Rob's interview, take his opinion for it, or don't do that, but form your own opinion, but listen to the information that's out there if you're going to do so, and hopefully you can come up with the right answer, whatever that may be. Anyway, in the end, the point here is that if there's already less above ground gold than silver, and you look at some of these supply and demand numbers, keep in mind that hopefully my decimals are correct here, but if you take that 88 million ounces at a roughly $1,200 gold price, comes out to around, let's call it $100 billion, versus the leftover silver, which is about 100 million ounces of the 900 that becomes available for investment purposes at current price of about $16 is, let's call it 1.6, almost $2 billion. So, you have not a lot there, where to actually for one person to move the gold market requires a lot more money, versus silver, you can't just show up. I mean, if someone did something like the Hunt brothers now, which there are many that feel that some of the banks have changed their position and now have been cornering the silver market. So anyway, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. The short version is I think there's less silver than many people realize, and again, the great demand for it and that it's consumed. I personally like silver over gold. I think both are good to have. Again, thinking about other things outside of the precious metals, whether that's cryptocurrencies or if there are stocks or private investments that you like. Again, like we mentioned Jim Rogers mentioned in the interview we talked about yesterday, invest in what you know. Don't just take somebody else's word for it. And hopefully this is a bit encouraging, that you don't have to feel like the guys on Wall Street are smarter. In many cases, they're not, as I saw firsthand. I mean, I fit in there at one point, so it can't be that hard. Anyway, so leave your comments below. Any questions come up. And hopefully now you have a little bit of idea of why there are a lot of people who like silver over gold. So with that said, thanks for watching. We'll see you again tomorrow.